Hello geometry students, and welcome to a video on angle pairs and their relationships. So we're going to look at 5 different kinds of angle pairs here, and you can see them all. If you find this paper, you should be able to add some notes to it. And we've got different kinds of angle pairs. There's a lot of overlap here, so they can be, some pairs of angles can be in more than one of these types. All right, so let's look at the first type, which is vertical angles. Vertical angles are just when you have two lines that intersect, like that, and they form 4 angles when that happens, right? 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, it doesn't really matter how you number them, but I just number these across from each other. Now, vertical angles are the ones that are across from each other on the diagram. So, angles 1 and 2, you might say, oh, those aren't vertical, those are horizontal. Well, we're not talking about that kind of vertical here. We're talking about a definition in geometry, which pretty much means any angles that are across from each other when lines intersect. So angles 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. So angles 1 and 2. Now, one thing important, very important about vertical angles, they're always congruent. So I'm going to say not only are angles 1 and 2 vertical angles, but that makes them congruent to each other. In other words, they have the same measure. And then also angles 3 and 4 are congruent to each other because they're vertical angles. Okay, so there it is. Vertical angles across from each other. All right, almost the opposite of that would be adjacent angles. And these are angles that are next to each other. So two angles that are next to each other, they share a common side. So something like this. If you have one angle, and we've already looked at the angle addition postulate, but here's 2 angles. They don't have to be the same size or anything, but angles 1 and 2, they're next to each other. They share a side. They share this side right here, and therefore they are adjacent angles. Okay? So angle 1 and angle 2 are adjacent. It's not quite as powerful as vertical angles because just because they're adjacent doesn't mean that they equal any particular thing, okay, unless there's some special cases that we're going to see coming up. So these, the vertical angles, are important because not only do they have a word and a definition, but they are always congruent. All right, let's look at one kind of adjacent angles called a linear pair. We've seen these a little bit, and we're going to define them now. So if we have a straight line and any direction here, 1 and 2, these are 2 angles. These angles form a linear pair. Now you might be thinking, wait a second, they're adjacent. You're right, they are adjacent. And they are supplementary. Supplementary meaning that they add up to 180 degrees. So angles 1 and 2 add up to 180. The measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 equals 180. Okay? That's because being a linear pair, they make a straight angle. A straight angle is 180 degrees. And so these two add up to 180. That makes them supplementary, which is the next definition. Now, supplementary angles, they don't have to be touching. So you can have something like this. Here's a 45-degree angle. And something like this, completely detached from it. And let's just say that's about a 135-degree angle. These are not drawn to scale. I'm doing my best, but might be off by a few degrees. And because 45 plus 135 equals 180, these angles are supplementary. Okay, that's just one example. You want to see another example? Well, you just saw one right there. That's another example of supplementary angles. So like I said, there is definitely overlap because linear pairs are actually 3 things that we've already talked about. They're a linear pair because they form a straight angle. They are adjacent because they share a side. And they're supplementary because they add up to a straight angle of 180 degrees. All 3. All right, let's look at a pair of complementary angles. And they can be touching. By the way, another example here, just to make sure that we're clear, this would be another example of supplementary angles, 2 angles that form a straight angle. Now, with complementary angles, we can take an angle that's, let's say, a little 20-degree angle and a slightly bigger, let's say, 70-degree angle, and because they add up to 90, they're complementary angles. Okay? Sometimes they're touching. So here's an example of perpendicular lines. Okay, they're not named, but now if I put another line in here and I form angles 1 and angle 2, those angles are also complementary. Okay, so you got 5 angle pairs from vertical angles, linear pairs, supplementary, complementary, and adjacent angles.